Do I look as good as I'm gonna?
Yeah.
Hey, CR Parsons here, once again cooking during Corona. As you can see, I am in my fancy commercial kitchen. No, this is just my home kitchen. But that's where I did the first video from too, and you saw how messy it is, so I'm not worried about that. We've got a puzzle, we've got all kinds of stuff around here. But today, we are going to bake bread. That's right, during this virus, bread has run out at the grocery stores for some people, and some people just don't know the basics of making bread. So I'm going to show you how to make a really easy, really no-nonsense loaf of bread. It goes this easy. You use flour, yeast, water. We're going to use milk. Now I've got dried milk here, and that's because of the coronavirus. We've got sugar, and of course a little oil. And that's all it is. There's mixing of these ingredients in certain orders and proportions, using the mixer if you have one. If not, you can do it by hand. And a little baking time, a little waiting time, and you're in good shape. We're going to start with the water. Now, under normal circumstances, I would use half a cup of water. I don't know what that weighs in grams, although I should, because when you're baking, doing everything in grams is best. But in this case, I don't know, but you would use a half a cup of water. But then what you add to that is a half a cup of milk. And again, during this coronavirus, milk has occasionally been hard to get a hold of. So I got a hold of powdered milk. Now you'll notice this is powdered buttermilk. That is a little more acidic milk, a little sweeter usually than regular milk. But this, for baking, does great. So what I need is I need a half a cup, and with this, it is 2 tablespoons per half a cup. So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of this powdered milk powder to my water. So that effectively makes 1 half a cup of water and 1 half a cup of milk. I'm going to stir that up real good. Now to that water and milk combination, I'm going to add some yeast. Now I need to proof this yeast because it's active dry yeast, not instant yeast. So I need to make sure that it's going to be alive when I get it in my bread so that it can make all of those great bubbles that give you great bread. So to do that, I'm going to add a little bit of sugar. Now, I will tell you that I'm going to add about a half a teaspoon, maybe almost a teaspoon. Just not a whole lot. Just enough to give the yeast a little something to eat on while they're getting ready to go in the bread. Then to that, I'm going to add 5 to 7 grams of yeast. I say 5 to 7 because my original recipe called for 5, but the first time I did it, it didn't really rise the way I wanted it to. So I added a little extra and it poofed right up. It was beautiful. So I'm going to add here about 7 grams of yeast. 6, 7, there we go, and stir this up. Now, I will tell you, you want to use warm water for this because that allows the yeast to wake up quickly and be ready to go. So it may take anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes for your yeast to activate. That means they start bubbling up, and you can see them and hear them bubbling in there. You can see that the amount has risen from about a cup to just over a cup because of the foam that's on top of that. And that's what you want. That tells you that your yeast are alive and in good shape headed into this. Really? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure out my flour. You will notice I'm using AP flour, or all-purpose flour. Now there are those that will tell you you cannot make good bread without bread flour. And bread flour does have more proteins in it, which means it has more gluten by the time you make it into your dough. And gluten is what holds in those little air bubbles, which gives you a nice, fluffy, small, bubbled bread. AP flour can be a little more dense, which is part of why I use a little more yeast than the normal recipe calls for. That's why I go 5 to 7, maybe even 9 grams of yeast as opposed to 5. But I'm using AP flour, so that helps it puff up a little bit more. I also let it proof a little bit longer, let it sit and let those air bubbles happen a little bit longer, which also helps make AP flour a good bread instead of having to use bread flour. Now, I like to use AP flour because it is almost always available and it is significantly cheaper than bread flour. I weigh out my flour. I don't trust cup measures because flour can pack down in there, and so you can be getting a lot more flour per cup than you think you are. So I always use a weight measurement for my flour when making bread. For this recipe, I am looking for 360 grams of flour. Oh, so close, so close.
354.
Right at 360. Oh, come on. Just right there. There we go, 360 grams. That's what I'm looking for in my flour. So this is where this bread gets easy, because once I get my measurements weighed out, it's just a matter of combining them all. Now, I personally, a lot of people will tell you you want to use the muffin method, which means you take your heavy dry goods and you put them in the bottom and then you add your liquid. I personally don't do it that way. I take my yeast, which is nice and foamy, and pour it in first. Make sure I get all of that yeast down in there so that it can make our bread nice and fluffy and tasty and, oh, smells so good. Then I add my flour, just right on top. I just pour it in there. I don't worry about making sure that it all gets hydrated. It's gonna have time to get all hydrated. Now, the one thing I missed in my measurements earlier and in my list of ingredients, and I cannot believe I did this, was salt. I forget about salt half the time because I don't use a lot of salt when I cook. I do cook with a little bit, but because I've got high blood pressure personally, I don't use a lot of it. But in this case, you do want a little. I use 10 grams of salt. Now, that's not a whole lot of salt. As you can see, that's less than a tablespoon, easily less than a tablespoon. And I just add it right to the flour, right there on top, because I'm going to end up putting it in the mixer, and it's all going to get mixed together anyway. What I don't want to do is add that to my yeast mixture, because I don't want the salt killing my yeast. And then, because I'm making a little sweeter bread, you take and add 2 tablespoons of sugar. So there's 2 good tablespoons of sugar. And that's it. Now, the last thing I need is a 1/4 cup of oil. Now, I am using very cheap, Best Choice olive oil. You can use melted butter. Just make sure the butter's not overly hot when you add it. You can use whatever kind of oil you want. Whatever your household likes, use that oil. We are an olive oil family. We love our olive oil. Now, this spout I'm not particularly fond of, but I love my olive oil. I know, can you tell? It's a little bit irritating with this thing. It's supposed to be able to pour one direction and drizzle out the other, but I've never quite figured it out. See, it kind of pours, but it kind of doesn't. But yeah, you take a 1/4 cup of olive oil or 1/4 cup of oil of whatever type you want. Like I said, you can use melted butter in this application. Would be delicious in this bread, especially if you like browned butter taste, which most people do. You just add your oil right there to the top, and then all of this goes in the mixer with your bread hook. I start out very slow because if you start out very fast, you're going to have poof, all of that flour up in the air, and you will know you have made a mistake. So I start out a little bit slow, slowly come up in speed until it's mixing it fairly well. Like I said, every once in a while you're going to want to do this and scrape your sides down, especially if you have a mixer that does not quite get everything off of the sides and the bottom. and you're going to see things slowly incorporate. As you can see down in here, if you can see down in here, we have a ball of dough that is slowly pulling away from the side, and that is exactly what we want. However, a lot of recipes will tell you when it pulls away from the side, it's done. I will tell you, when it pulls away the first time, it's probably not done. It usually takes 7 or 8 minutes of kneading on your bread hook at a nice medium speed to really get there.
So that what it does throw up there doesn't stay up there. And make sure that it all gets mixed in to that dough. Scrape up the bottom just so it's not always what is on bottom. And then I like to scrape down the dough hook as well, just to make everything move around a little bit. I don't want anything where it started out in this mix.
We've been about 7 or so minutes. It's pulling back away from the side again. At the bottom, you can see it's still a little sticky, but it's pulling away from the side enough that I am fairly certain that that is about ready. What I do is I scrape down the hook and just scrape all of that dough off into the bottom of this little mixing bowl here. Now, unlike cake, this is not a hook you want to lick. It's just not that good. It will be delicious, but it is not that good yet. I'm going to toss that out on the counter here for a second, just mainly so I can get my hands on it and see how it feels. So I'm going to put a little bit of flour down just so it doesn't try to stick too hard to my table or counter or wherever I'm working with. I'm going to scrape this down real good and turn that dough out right here in front of me. And this is where I get to use the tools that are designed for this. Now that was laziness doing that, because I should have sat here and kneaded it myself, but I didn't want to work that hard. So this is where I get a chance to get my hands on the dough, see how it feels, see how soft it is, make sure it's very pliable, make sure it has that feel that I want, and make sure I can roll it and it makes a bit of a skin on there. See how that's doing that without cracking or anything? So I just want to roll that into a little bit of a ball, kind of seal up that bottom where I was squeezing it under. So I just roll it under like that, take it and seal it up. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back in here, but I don't want it to stick. So I'm going to take and put a little oil in the bottom there. Make sure it's got a good bit. Don't worry, you're not going to over oil your bread. Then I take the top and I put it down in there first and roll it around, and then flip it over and roll it around. And that is where it's going to proof for a little bit. Now I want to cover it up. This time I'm going to cover it with a little plastic wrap. Sometimes I use plastic wrap, sometimes I just use a tea towel. Either way works. I find that with the plastic wrap, I don't get as much of a crust on the bread, which I don't want right now. So I do that, and then I take and I put this in the oven. Now you may wonder, you're cooking it already? No, I'm using my oven as a proofing box. Walk with me. So I'm going to put my dough into the oven. Now the oven is not turned on. What you want to do is you want to put this in a nice warm place to proof. So I'm going to turn the light on the oven on, which lights put off a little bit of heat, and we're going to put the dough in there, but then I'm going to add something that a lot of people don't. Here I have a bowl of water that is almost at boiling temperature. If I had an electric tea kettle, I could pour it directly from the electric tea kettle, something like that. I put this in there right beside the dough, just because it adds a little warmth and a little moisture. That way I make sure the dough does not dry out. And I'm going to leave that there for about an hour. You want it to double in size. Now, if it doubles before an hour, you're fine, pull it out. But I like to leave it a good hour, give it a chance to create all of those bubbles, give those yeast an opportunity to do their work without me having to do all of their work for them. So our timer has just gone off. It's been right at an hour, and I want to check and see how our bread is doing. So coming out of the oven, oh, you can see instantly. Take a look right here. It has puffed up to easily twice its size, which means the yeast is doing its job quite well. Just going to set aside the plastic here. I need a little bit of flour on the counter, just so I don't make a mess. Little bit of flour here, just spread out so you can see. Let's do this over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this out. It should come out fairly easily, and that's why I oiled everything. But you can see it's just an amorphous blob at this point. It has lots of air bubbles in it. You just want to punch those out because we don't want great big air bubbles. We want tiny air bubbles. So I'm just going to punch all of those air bubbles out as much as I can, and then I'm going to start shaping it. And all I do to do that is I turn it and I pull up. Turn, pull, turn, pull, turn, pull, turn, pull until it's a nice ball. Stretch it out real good. Again, we're back to that ball shape we started with. See how that worked? Everything's nice and neat here at the bottom. Pinch it if it's not. Get it all shaped up. Now, at this point, if I were going to do loaves, I might split this and put it into 2 different loaf pans. I, however, prefer to do a more rustic style, so I like to use the cast iron skillet. And for that, I'm going to put just a little oil in the bottom, and when I say just a little, I mean like 2 or 3 drops is about it. Just enough to cover that bottom when it's all spread out, and use my hands, spread that oil out real good. Then I'm going to take the dough and I'm going to place it right in the middle there, and then I'm going to cover it again with the plastic. Not too awful tight, just a little bit. I definitely don't want to inhibit it from moving, because what we're going to do now is we're going to set this in a nice warm place. Now for me, the nice warm place that works best is on my stove top, not with an eye going, but as my oven preheats. Because what this is going to do is it's going to rise again. It's going to almost double in size again. It's going to puff up, and then we're going to put it in the oven. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up here. I'm going to set my timer for about 30 minutes, see how it does, and then we'll go from there. So as you can see, the bread has risen a good bit. It's not quite doubled in size, but it's getting there. So I'm going to go ahead and preheat my oven so that it's ready to go when this is. And I'm going to set it for 350. Now the reason I'm going 350 and not 400 is because we did use milk and sugar in this. So we want to set the temperature a little bit lower than we might if we had not used any milk or sugar. So go ahead and set it to preheat. We're going to let the oven heat up, and then we'll get the bread in. And with that, the oven has preheated, so now we're going to uncover our bread, which has puffed up nicely, as you can see. What we're going to do is we're going to pop it in the oven. We're going to set a timer for 30 minutes and see how it is. It may need another 5 or so minutes at the end of 30, but 30 would be at least what it needs to cook.
I'm ready.
Okay, the timer has gone off. It's been right at 30, almost 35 minutes. Want to check it, see where it is. Oh, this looks beautiful. Got a nice brown top. You can tell it's got a little firmness to it, not overly firm, but nice and firm. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. If you scoot up here, you can see where it continued to rise a little bit as it cooked around that edge. Now I want to get it out of the pan, because if I leave it in the pan, it will just get soggy and gross. So I want to get it out of the pan. Easiest way to do that is up on a wire rack. And it does not matter, it doesn't have to be that close of a wire rack. It can be one with just a few strands of wire. But you want to get this out where it can cool off and have air moving all the way around it. And if you're wondering, yeah, it's not so hot that I couldn't do that. But if you're worried, put another hot mitt on your other hand and let it sit for a little bit. I know everybody, I mean, if you had smell-o-vision, you'd be smelling this. Everybody wants to cut into it right now. Everybody wants that hot, fresh bread with butter and just the whole 9 yards. Don't do it. Don't do it. Because it's almost impossible to cut right now, even with the best knife you could possibly have, because it wants to collapse, because it has so much moisture in there still. What you want to do is give it a little bit of time, let it cool down a little bit, then cut it. Warm up your butter if you need to. The bread will still be warm, it just won't be hot. So there we are. Okay, our bread has been cooling. It is now cooler. It is still not cold, it's just cooler. And I'm gonna go ahead and cut it open. Now I will tell you, it's still a little heavy. It's on the denser side, but that's because we use the AP flour. I like to use a serrated knife, a knife with little bitty serrations, because it makes it easier to cut bread. If you use a regular knife, it will cut if your knife is extremely sharp. But if your knife is the slightest bit not sharp, all you're gonna do is you're gonna crush your bread. We don't want that. So, I like to slice it and take a look. Oh, perfect. Look at that cell pattern. That, not too big, not too small, nice crumb. It's not crumbly. If I run my finger across it, it's not gonna fall apart. So that is perfect. My wife loves the heel of bread, so I'm not gonna eat that slice. I'm gonna slice myself a slice right here, because I would be in so much trouble if she caught me eating a heel slice. So I'm just gonna take this little slice here, add a little butter to it, take a taste, see how this turned out. Delicious, still slightly warm, not hot, but slightly warm. The butter's delicious. Tonight we're gonna have this with dinner, and I will tell you what we are having is Italian. So I've got some Kerrygold garlic butter that we're gonna use on this. Oh, it's gonna be great. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm pointing somewhere, like I know where those things will be. But don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this video, and I'll catch you later.